Ooh, some wind.
I guess so.
Leave the door closed, huh? Well, I just want to start off by thanking you again for your willingness to talk with me today. Appreciate that.
Interesting experience. I've been interviewed under various circumstances, but this is quite a new one when someone makes a special trip to.
I'm very excited to
record.
talk with you. I appreciate that you're letting me.
All right. Well, it should be fun. I hope.
Do you mind just introducing yourself for the camera?
Do what?
Do you mind introducing yourself for the camera? I obviously already know you, but they don't.
That sounds a little funny.
Okay.
Anyhow, I'm Bob Doty, and here I am.
Okay. That'll do. Thank you. Okay. I understand you grew up in New Rochelle, New York, in the 20s. Is that
I
correct?
grew up in Chicago mostly.
Chicago. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about?
I
some
was
of your-
born in New Rochelle, New York,
Okay.
but I didn't stay there but a few months.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. Could you tell me just a little bit about how your childhood was?
How what?
Your childhood was?
Well, the main feature of my childhood was that my mother died under surgery for goiter when I was not quite 7 years old. And as described in my biographical sketch, some of my schoolmates, being less civilized, would tease me to the fact that my mother was dead, etc. And to that I've rather attributed anthropic condition, but it's never biased my life to a great degree. And then my father remarried, and I had a stepmother who was not particularly inclined to intellect or appreciation of a young, uncontrollable boy. And that made life a little difficult, so that I left home when I was 17 years old, and just after graduating from high school. Happily, I had a job at that time of assembling electric ranges at Hot Point. It was part of General Electric ultimately. And so, as a free soul and a little money in my pocket, I had a great life. Happily survived it, which sometimes questionable. I lost one of my girlfriends probably because of a fight I had on coming home from the Feast of St. Rocco's. That was a big Italian celebration in one of the slums of Chicago, and about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning I was driving my little Model A Ford down a deserted northern street, and up at a stoplight, why, some guy gets out of his car and bangs me in the jaw. So I had to check on my gear shift, and I came out after him, and they decided they didn't like the blackjack. But anyhow, long story short, we had a little set-to on that sort of thing, and my girlfriend thought that was a little rough. So anyhow, that's kind of a very free, quick association overview of childhood. Oh, the thing that I mentioned, you see, I'm well practiced at this, having written up autobiographical sketch as to how I became a scientist, was my 2 summers I spent on the farms of relatives down in Plymouth, Indiana. And that was just a wonderful experience of getting close to the land and learning about animals and their care and getting the crops in and all the problems. I taught all the kids how to swim down there and so forth. And I rode my bike there 120 miles from Chicago
Quite a ride.
with the wind against me on that particular day, as I remember. So all those sort of things sort of gave my background. But the The overwhelming thing, I suspect, from particularly reading about people who have lost a parent at an early age, this is a common feature for many people who succeed in life. And Abraham Lincoln is one of the first that comes to mind, and so on. But there are dozens and dozens of others. Oh, damn, excuse me, I better grasp all that. My what? Now, you have to forgive, I didn't put my $1,000 hearing aid in because I use it only for presentations when there's a lot of noise and audience and so forth. So I'm a little hard of hearing. I speak slowly and loudly.
Sure, okay. I wanted to see if it was okay to ask you about your experience with scarlet fever at 14.
Oh, that came through. Yeah, that was interesting. Well, in those days, you were quarantined, so that if you had this streptococcal infection, which was highly contagious, and my wife was deaf for some time after her experience with scarlet fever. Very serious. And so my father couldn't afford to be quarantined, so what do they do with the guy who's got the disease? They put him in the contagious disease hospital. And since I was 14, I qualified as an adult, which an education. As I say, my roommates, there were 3 of them. One was a tramp, and one of the other guys was a gangster, and of course he kept telling wild tales of his exploits and so forth. And the other guy had one leg, and he kept displaying his stump and so forth. So all of these guys, and of course they spoke the usual cursing language, and I picked up quite a vocabulary. But yeah, that was an interesting experience with the common man. So then when as I think I wrote, when I started delivering my papers in 4 o'clock in the morning, I continued that vocabulary. I confess it's still with me.
Okay, I also understand that you served in the Navy from 1942.
No. Oh, no. I was commissioned in the Quartermaster Corps, and since I was so smart, I was probably the only guy in our class that could understand the gas laws of entropy and all that sort of thing. So I was sent to refrigeration school in Fort Warren, Wyoming, and I fared quite well there. I understood all of the heat lag things, how long it takes the afternoon sun to get into cool house and that sort of stuff. And I had a cadre assigned to me at Vancouver Barracks in Washington, and I was to go to New Guinea with a refrigeration company that I'd be the commander of. And that sounded great because I'd be a captain very soon, because that, first lieutenant or second lieutenants weren't usually in charge of refrigeration. Well, that was all set up one day, and the next day I'm in the Transportation Corps and headed for Brooklyn Army Base. And, I complained about this and all that and so forth. Oh, and the other part of the story, see, this is a very important story in our memory, that when I was out there at Fort Warren, it looked like I might be assigned a teaching job and I might stay stateside for some time. So I insisted that my wife had to give up our hard-won apartment and the job that she had just gotten a promotion after 2 years, and she resisted that very strenuously. And we were both right, because she had her point that, you know, this may not last, and she's going to give up all of this hard-won life. On the other hand, I said, you know, I may get shot up, and that's the end of us, and so we should enjoy every moment that we can. Well, ultimately, and this is part of the female evolutionary instinct, she did give it up and joined me at Fort Warren. And as I say, somewhere in the sketch I made of this, we had a total of around 38 days from the time that she joined me until I was on the ship for North Africa. So that's the way things are in the Army. You have no idea or control. If they want you to take that machine gun nest, that's what you do. And so that's what I had to do, was to go to Brooklyn Army Base and become a transport commander. And pretty soon I was headed for Norfolk, and a contingent of, I guess it was some 300 military police that I had as transport commander to transport to North Africa to take care of that enormous load of Africa Corps prisoners that we had just done from the victories in North Africa. And then on the return voyage, I brought back these about 700 Kriegsgefangenen from the Africa Corps. Wow. So anyhow, it wasn't in the Navy. I fought the bloody Navy, tooth and nail. One of the stories I have about fighting the Navy is that on another trip, the third trip, I had been bombed. And the ship's aerial was shot down by, I don't know whether our gunners or the ship next to us, and crashed into my helmet. And so I could see these wild guys with their 40 millimeter cannons raking the landscape or the horizon, and you weren't very safe up topside because they might shoot you. And in fact, the major problems in combat is these eager beaver guys who are ready to shoot anything that moves, and it may be their buddy that they're shooting. So then, to make the long story short, I was then quite aware of this danger of the wild men arming the Navy anti-aircraft guns, so that when we had an attack south of Crete one morning, the Navy guy's instruction was to get everybody up on topside to be ready, with their life vests on, ready to abandon ship. And I could see then they were just ready for the slaughter if the Navy anti-aircraft guns raked our ship. So I insisted they go down below decks where they'd be safe. And so that bit of the fight, I won that one because I had the experience and the Navy officer didn't. Oh, wow. But that's the sort of thing. That and the Merchant Marine. The Merchant Marine were all happy to get bombed because they got $200 extra for every bombing attack. And we weren't too keen about that sort of thing. And also they wanted, on the first ship, well, I got that all settled, but it was a big fight that the group wanted to take overtime because they had someone other than the crew to look after me, that I ate in the officers' mess. So the stewards department decided that they needed overtime. Well, happily, I had one of the officers of the National Maritime Union also on the ship, and he could see this wasn't very good publicity to be demanding overtime for serving an Army officer. So, but anyhow, I was then in the Army the whole time, and I sailed on merchant ships, and my duty was to look after the cargo. I was a cargo security officer to see that it wasn't all stolen when it got to the other side, and that it wasn't pilfered by the crew. and then was a transport commander, that I was in command of any troops on board and up them, even though actually in the first voyage there were a couple of captains and so on, and I was just a little shave tail. But since I was a transport commander, why, I assigned them duties and what they had to do and running the ship. Anyhow, that's the situation.
Okay. Was there also a ship that sank on the Isle of Capri?
Yes, well, that was another one. That was an interesting voyage. That one where we were bombed on Armistice Day. And so we went into Palermo at first, and that was a wild situation. And then we loaded a cargo of high-octane aviation gas to take gasoline to take to Naples, and we sat at Naples Bay for a week or so, and then finally we unlat, and then we're waiting to load for the Anzio invasion. We didn't know that at the time, but that's what all these ships were accumulating in Naples Bay. But then there was a very strong wind blowing down off Vesuvius, which incidentally was in eruption. Just beautiful display every night. And we had both anchors out, but the offshore wind was so strong, and so without cargo, the ship is way high out of the water, so it was pushed out between the Isles of Capri and Ischia. And presumably, since there were two shots that straddled the engine room, we assumed that it was torpedoes. I've never seen a full investigation. They undoubtedly should have cashiered the captain of that ship for getting it out so far into dangerous water. Mm-hmm. But, and that's the other thing. That's why I've been rather flagrant about life's dangers ever since, because had I not been sick from eating cannoli at the Italian opera laced with salmonella, and I was sick as a dog, and up topside, all safe from the torpedoes, and the first torpedo hit right smack in the middle of the tween-deck office that I would normally have been in that time of day.
Wow.
So that was this close call kind of thing. So, yeah, all in the book I described all that stuff.
So after you were finished with that, what did you do?
Well, then I was on shore, and I sent one of my description of my occupation of the Pension Maurizio, of a major in the Italian army, and got to read all of his correspondence, his gas bills, and so forth and so on. But then I ultimately worked my way through the bureaucracy of the Army to some colonel who took mercy on me and gave me permission to fly to the States. So I got back to the States, and then I got another assignment, which was around the world tour. I think they were trying to get rid of me to send me to like they were sending everyone. They could foresee the end of the European theater operations, and they wanted to build things up in the Pacific. So I took a load of Thunderbolt fighter planes to Karachi, and also a platoon of meteorologists to Alexandria, Egypt, on that voyage. But then we continued on through the Indian Ocean and the Bass Sea south of Australia and up to ports in Los Angeles. And that was an interesting piece of knowing the ropes in the Army. My orders had said to return to Brook Base. But in the meantime, I'd been away for 3 months or something, and they decided this transcontinental travel was not in the Army's favor, and furthermore, they wanted more officers and going to the Pacific Theater, as I say. So they changed the orders that there would be no transcontinental travel. Well, I found some guy that didn't know about that and showed him my orders, which says return to Brooklyn Army Base, and so he did it, and I got to Chicago with my darling and wired Brooklyn Army Base, and they wired back that you're AWOL. So, but they were glad to see me back, nevertheless, except they gave me the most god-awful ship it was possible. It was an old Hog Islander, which was had more cockroaches than gasoline, diesel. And it was to be sunk as a breakwater, part of the Normandy operation. So that was another story, a colorful existence.
Very interesting. Can you tell me a little about your 2 sons and your 2 daughters and what they're doing now?
Well, that's a strange story. All of them went through their master's degree and were accepted into doctoral programs, and every damn one walked away from it.
Oh.
So why, I have no idea. My wife and I just couldn't comprehend whether they couldn't compete with the old man or what this was, but anyhow, that's the way it was. My eldest son worked with Vernon Mountcastle, one of the big wheels in neuroscience. In fact, he was the first president of the Society for Neuroscience. And he walked away from that after doing some beautiful work for his thesis, but stopped. He's now a kind of a supervisor of computer construction and repair for a place I can't remember. It used to be Selectron. It has another name now. And in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Oh, okay. Very close to my home.
Mm-hmm. And then my daughter Mary, who just called, was going to be a psychologist, was all set to go and get her degree at Cornell. And again, she walked away, although she had a child at the time. She had her daughter who just died of breast cancer this last May. But again, she gave it up, and now she works at a shoe store. Well, it isn't quite a shoe store. It's a place that sells these kind of boots and so on. But the beauty of it is that she can take off whenever she wants, and she has a partner, and they exchange duties. So it's an easy job and so forth. And then daughter Cheryl went out to, got her degree at Boulder in Colorado, and then was in a doctoral program at Fort Collins, where she spent a summer doing experiments with prairie dogs. But again, she gave that up and became a school teacher for a bit, but ever since she's bounced around and got married, and they lived just up on the road, on Fishel Road there from us for 10 years or so, and her husband and she ran a trucking concern. And then they were smart enough they got out before the trucking industry kind of part with the high gas prices, etc. But she was in real estate, and the real estate business also began to fall apart. And so about a year and a half, 2 years maybe ago, she moved to Phoenix. And she's had several jobs. I don't know, she keeps getting all these jobs. She seems to have gotten one that is going to last now. She started out as being the assistant manager of the airport at the Grand Canyon.
Oh.
as part of the Department of Transportation for the state of Arizona. And then, I don't know, there's various political things going on now. Oh, and they had a wonderful home they'd bought in Phoenix. And so then they moved to Colorado, to the Grand Canyon, and they couldn't sell their house given the real estate market. But now it turns out they were real lucky because she's now stationed back in Phoenix.
That worked out.
Grand Canyon, maybe she goes once a month or something up there. So that's it. And then my son, he started out with a great flurry of things at Cornell and gave that up for a while and joined us here on the farm. And then he went to Michigan to get his degree in psychology, and he just didn't want to quit. So now, and he's working today, trying to still hoping to get to be a mail carrier, which a rural mail carrier is a real cushy job. It pays you, like $50,000 a year. And anyhow, with all the benefits, etc. So he's been working on that. So, they live their life. That's their way.
Okay. So what initially influenced you to choose a job in neuroscience? Or just to choose neuroscience?
No, what's the question?
What initially drew you to neuroscience? Where did your interest in neuroscience come from?
Oh, well, that's obvious, as you know, too, that the brain is cells, and understanding mankind and one's place in the universe is dependent upon the organ that endeavors to comprehend it. So it's actually, I think it's the quintessential scientific question as to the nature of consciousness and how it is produced from the physical entities that are undoubtedly unequivocally proven to be essential to its existence and production of experience. But how the experience devolves from all the molecular comings and goings among these peculiar cells, the neurons, is a total mystery. And that's what I'm presently returned to writing my book. I was going to write this book on brain, mind, and God, what was it, something anyhow, a survey of man's understanding of his place in nature. And so I'd been reading a great deal about quantum mechanics and relativity and so forth. But then I came down with this myosarcoma that I'm scheduled to die when nobody knows, because this is a peculiar cancer. But in the time shortly after I learned about this cancer, I wasn't quite aware whether I'd make it to the end of this year or not. So I sort of put aside this ambition of writing this complicated book. But since now I have a CAT scan scheduled for next March, I assume that the oncologist figures that I'm going to make it. And so I'm going to, and I had a real coup yesterday. I downloaded a PDF of Herschel's demonstration of the invisibility of sunlight in the infrared. Beautiful paper in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1800, in which he was looking for filters to look at observe the sun without becoming blind. And so he was measuring the heat transmission through various colors of filters. And so he had the spectrums put out on the prism, and he measured things. And for a control, he put it right next to the red part of the spectrum. Control gave the highest reading of all, because that was the infrared and invisible sunlight. So this was a fantastic discovery, which ultimately, of course, led to the recognition of the electromagnetic spectrum. The other thing that I found in 1801, the next year, the Bakerian lectures by Thomas Young showed how it was possible with the prism pinhole and that sort of thing to spread out the spectrum of the light to where you could show interference patterns. And the interference showed that, contrary to Newton, it had to be a wave phenomenon. Whereas Newton had thought all the little colors were different packages, the quanta. Well, of course, they were both right, but the fact that Young could demonstrate, and not only demonstrate it, he could measure the wavelength, the different light colors, that it was a wave phenomenon was fundamental to our understanding. So anyhow, that's my beginning of then the tracing through the Maxwell equations and Planck's discoveries and Einstein's contributions and so on. So,
very interesting.
Yeah, if you want, I can send you my preliminary musings on that chapter. I haven't much beyond Herschel and Young, but...
I would love to look at it. I would be honored. Who would you say influenced you the most early in your career, and why?
Well, one of the most important things was my reading of the book by Sir James Jeans called Mysterious Universe when I was about 18. And in there, one of the you know, how books have a quotation of something at the beginning. Mm-hmm. He took from Plato's Republic the what's it called, the analogy of the prisoners in the cave. And all they could judge of reality was on the shadows on the wall, and showing that it is one's perception of things which are limiting to one's comprehension of what reality is about. And to me, that was such a startling revelation. And plus then Jean's discussion of the cosmos and what was then known about galaxies and so on. That got me so overwhelmingly influenced in science. But I guess I was always that way. I bear the scars of my first experiment. When I was about 9 years old, I was doing an experiment with ants. I'd put them in a bottle in water, and when they were motionless, then I'd put them out in the sun and see how long it took them to resuscitate and how long you could keep them in the water that they would still resuscitate, etc. Well, the experiment was terminated when I couldn't get some of the ants out of the Coke bottle, and I put my finger into it, and the neck of it broke, and I bear the scar across my forefinger to this day. But anyhow, that shows that I was interested in, and a lot of people have taken this fact of the ant colony as a superorganism, you see. And I just read this book by John Tyler Boner about his slime molds. And the slime mold is an individual amoeba, but they all send chemical signals between themselves, and when they get to a certain state, then they kind of coalesce into a group and become a slime mold and move in a pattern, so that here you see the acquisition of the metazoan way of life from these individual amoebae, and the chemical signals which they transform them from one modus vivendi to another. And anyhow, those kinds of things have always fascinated me.
Very interesting. That's a young age.
Yeah, I guess, well, again, maybe it's something to do with losing one's mother, you know, about it ain't going to last forever or something of the sort that stirs you up to be a serious person rather than just watching the soccer game or something.
I know you already spoke to me a little bit about your dissertation.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk a little more about the research that you did for it?
Oh, well, again, it was the beauty that Girard had access to money from the Office of Naval Research in the immediate post-war era. And of course, I was going to school on the GI Bill, one of the most wonderful things the country ever did, and we need to continue it. I think at last they're waking up that they should. So anyhow, when my thesis with the metabolism of the rat's spinal cord collapsed, I was left to figure something out. Well, we'd had on those experiments, we really, in those days in medical school and physiology things, we had real laboratories. So we did these experiments on dogs. And one of the experiments was on swallowing, that if you stimulate the superior laryngeal nerve, which innervates the back of the pharynx, the animal will swallow. And the laboratory notes said, well, then you stimulate the glossopharyngeal nerve, and that's supposed to inhibit swallowing. So I guess the idea, since inhibition was a big question as to what is the nature of inhibition and how does it work, that the other part of this puzzle was that Girard has had an electrical engineer student who had built the world's greatest electrical pulse generator. So this generator could generate patterns of stimuli, could put in 2 stimuli or 1 and followed by 3 or 4 and all kinds of different complex ways. So I figured, well, I can measure the timing between the excitatory stimuli over the superior laryngeal nerve and the inhibitory going over the glossopharyngeal and see if I can decipher something about the relation between the excitatory and inhibitory components controlling swallowing. Well, it turned out the glossopharyngeal didn't work. It didn't have produced this. But I then used the capabilities of this pulse generator to show that the afferent portal, which you stimulate all this bundle of nerve fibers in the superior laryngeal nerve, and it goes into the brain stem, and there it could be shown that it didn't matter what frequencies within a wide band were involved. It was how within a given interval, so that it was kind of a magic number that this afferent system could count the number of pulses, summating them quite independently of their rhythmic input. So that became my thesis, and I published the last thesis, I always claim, that used a smoked drum chymograph, which was the way that I recorded it from the muscle movements on this smoked drum. And of course, the smoked drum was shortly to be replaced by pen and ink galvanometer-driven recording things, but my thesis was recorded on the smoked drum. So how many swallows I got according to the pattern of electrical pulses delivered to the superior laryngeal nerve. So anyhow, that's how I got that, and Roger was my outside examiner for my thesis.
That was actually my next question. Did you have a professional relationship at all with Dr. Sperry?
No, just that I was his student, in neuroanatomy, and that I went to him rather briefly for advice on our surgical procedures in trying to do this experiment on the dog, which was to reverse some kind of nervous innervation in the spinal cord, similarly to what he had done with the salamanders and so on.
Okay. Can you tell me a little what he was like?
What Sperry was like?
Uh-huh.
Well, he had a very quiet and subtle sense of humor, but he was also realistic, that he didn't buy, sort of the standard story. And his lectures were very fascinating and thoughtful, that he didn't just give you the old poop from the latest textbook, as it were. He was really thinking about things, and particularly taken with the way he described the complexities of movement, as to how it had to be organized and all the complications of sequencing and so forth, which of course was part of the reason he was on my outside examination, because that's what swallowing is a highly coordinated sequence of actions over a considerable period of time. So you have first the pattern of stimulation, and that was part of his that the timing and the spatial relationships were essential to getting a coordinated result. And also, on other occasions, he was a great fisherman. I remember sometime, where was it? I think, was it at Duke? Or no, it was in Florida, I guess. And he was commenting how he had gone fishing with one of my friends, but they brought the kids along and they wouldn't shut up and scared the fish and so forth. Anyhow, he was a very interesting fellow.
And very intelligent as well.
Yeah, well, and also when we were at the Pisano Award for him, Bob Galambos, I guess, had been a student with him. Anyhow, Galambos pictures of Sperry with his football helmet and his football uniform and so forth, that he was quite an athlete in his days at Oberlin. And,
I remember learning that about him.
yeah.
Interesting. So I know Dr. Puente and also Dr. Overman, who are at UNCW, they were your postdoctoral students.
Yes.
Can you just tell me a little about what you remember about them?
Oh, about Bill Overman? Oh, I never Puente.
Oh, okay.
Never laid eyes on him.
Okay.
we had, interchanged emails over and over again. I must say I was rather disappointed that nothing ever came of all this with Puente. But Overman, of course, was one of my colleagues, and we did some very fascinating things. At the time, we were quite engaged with studying memory monkeys, using this delayed matching to sample thing, that you show the monkey a picture and then it goes off and some time transpires and then the picture appears together with another picture, and the animal had to decide whether to pick either the one that he had seen or the one that he hadn't seen. And we did experiments in which we tetanized, and then part of this interhemispheric thing, I don't know quite how, I think it was from the German Schaltenbrand had put us onto this, that Schaltenbrand in human beings had had some funny observation about inhibition from stimulation in this area. Anyhow, Overman and I, and also since if you stimulate in the midline, The anterior commissure is going to go to both directions, so therefore you bugger hemispheres at once. Anyhow, our studies showed that if you stimulated the anterior commissure during or after showing the pictures, that the animal was wiped out. And stimulating in the splenium, which is way back and goes to both sides, did not do this. And stimulating in the hippocampus or in parts of the basal ganglia did not do it either. So there was something unique about the anterior commissural stimulation, which was one of the things that we did. The other thing that Bill had caught on to the fact that at Montreal they were showing that when you looked at a person's face, what you were looking at was their left hair face. So I set about and took a whole bunch of pictures, and then Bill Overman cut them right down the middle, and we made two halves and pasted them together. So we had two left faces and two right faces, and then we would we would show the person with their normal face, and then we would have a left side and a right side, the two halves put together, and ask them which looks the most like this person. And highly statistical, reliable number of them would choose the left face, showing that it's the right hemisphere which is specialized for looking at faces. This now is a little argument because human beings aren't all cast from the same mold, but by and large, if you have a lesion right inferior temporal cortex, then you are prosopagnotic, that you're unable to recognize your own mother and that sort of thing. Whereas this comparable lesions in the left hemisphere do not produce that kind of a prosopagnotic difficulty. So, on the other hand, our thing with the anterior commissure, as I say, probably is explicable simply because the anterior commissure projects into these inferior temporal lobe areas that are not only for faces but for a great variety of visual types of things, and would have perturbed both of them. Anyhow, this was a nice little study that we did with showing the preference for facial recognition by the right hemisphere.
Very successful one at that.
Yeah, it worked out quite well. And, don't know whether anyone knows that now or not.
Was interested in if you could have done research in some other area, what would it have been?
Oh, yeah, well, when I was still on the ships, I was thinking I'd be an endocrinologist and go to Uruguay. But of course, that was a wild, idiotic idea about the Uruguay part anyhow, but endocrinology might have been quite interesting. But no, I've always had a very broad approach to the nervous system, and when I taught, and that's the reason so much about it, because when I lectured, I took it all the way from the molecules of ions of axonal conduction up through the relations to mental activity and so forth. So, and I participated in quite a variety of things. In fact, that's probably why I've never really become famous, because I jump from one thing to the other. You know, some people and they work on the lamprey's spinal cord, and they do that for 50 years. and then they become an expert on the lamprey spinal cord, and they know exactly Steve Groner is the guy that does that. But when they come to what does Doty do, well, he did swallowing, and he did all this funny stuff with taking out the striate cortex and kitten. He did this split brain stuff, and so forth and so forth. So I guess, in a sense, I've done just what you're asking. I don't have to imagine what I might have done. It's all these funny things that I did do.
That's wonderful. You have knowledge in so many different areas.
Yeah, well, had I been good at mathematics, of course, I would probably have done more physics. But unfortunately, when I was physics, I hadn't had calculus, and the course was taught with calculus, and I had a rather difficult time keeping up. But I'm not sure I wasn't that good at calculus either, so. Especially, actually, the way they taught it was, for this mathematically specialized. I had my analytic geometry, a guy Halmos, who was part of the Bourbaki movement, a special mathematical society or something, as you might say. And his, for instance, one of the things was that, now, what the devil is it? A straight line is a point circle that, I can't remember it now anymore, but it is crazy definitions of things, and, there's multidimensional geometry. And, so I was no mathematician, let's put it that way.
So from all of the different areas that you've studied in and the different research you've done, what would you say is your most proud accomplishment?
Oh, huh. Oh, yeah, that's kind of tough. Yeah, there's several of them. It's swallowing certainly one, because I was quite a pioneer in that area. But then this showing the complexity of the visual processes could be surviving the deletion of the original input into the striate cortex. In other words, if there was a second pathway which could accommodate a great amount of visual capacity. But then probably the most interesting is this stuff with the split brain. And there's still one that we still don't know anything about, but we've shown that there's a connection of the amygdala that goes across to the other hemisphere. And no one knows about that or how it operates, but our definition of that is probably quite fundamental, but no one really knows. But on the other hand, I think some of the reviews that I've written, people have, and of course, there's the stuff we did with Georgia, which showed that simple temporal concatenation between two excitation pools in the cerebral cortex can be connected together independently of any motivational thing. So that, too, is a very fundamental observation. But, of course, there's no mechanism how to explain that. So, and again, as I say, a lot of this then we didn't pursue, and so it never came to full fruition as it might have.
Where do you see this research going in the next 10 years? Research on split brain and research on swallowing. Where do you think that'll go? Oh,
well, probably not very far. What's the next? The thing that I keep pushing is the opportunity available in having two independent entities, the two cerebral hemispheres, and how they talk to each other. People just aren't aware of that and aren't exploiting it. It is so prevalent in all of this fMRI and PET imaging study that this bilaterality of activity is, that's the way it works. But no one has put it together as to what it means for each hemisphere to be talking together, and why it's required and how it's doing it. All of those problems are so fundamental and right there begging to be asked, but they're not very seldom asked. So that, I think, is one of the major ways that things should go to make progress. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff going on, and keeping up with it. We have a new theory of how the fundamental process of the cortex is a disambiguation, that there's this overlap. The people have now shown from the retina on up, regardless, there's a chap by the name of Zielinski, who has shown that both the parasol and the, what the devil are the other ones? Anyhow, the two major classes of retinal ganglion cells are entirely different in their fundamental connections, their size, the distribution of their dendrites, but the amount of overlap between their visual fields is almost identical. So they can overlay the two Gaussian distributions of this, and they're just same. So that says that there's something fundamental about this overlap story, and overlap has to have disambiguation or it isn't going to work, because you have to know which component of these populations actually amounts to something. And what we've done is to separate them out by degrees. So a very simple experiment of showing a spot at one spot. If it's at the same spot, your reaction time is very quick. If you move it way out here, your reaction time is also very quick. But if you move it just a little bit, then it takes 100 milliseconds extra. And that's because we have to do the disambiguation. Is it this population or this population? And there's that much overlap. So to get what really happened to populations, to distinguish those populations, you have to deal with the overlap, which means the disambiguation. And we have a theory as to one of the first steps of that is a stimulus-specific adaptation, which everyone observes, and they don't put it into context as to what its significance is. So that's where we're going at the moment, with trying to find some electrophysical correlates of this disambiguation process. No, you're running out of memory or something. Each precious word doesn't have to get on there. Mispronunciations and all.
Is there anything else that you just would like to tell me that I haven't asked you?
Well, not that okay. I can go on rattling on for hours. No, one of my papers I'm most proud of is that one on alchemion. Did I send you that?
You did.
It seems to me that people just don't appreciate this discovery, that it had to be discovered. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't at all obvious that the brain had anything whatever to do with conscious perception and mentality and so on. So this is a major discovery which went unrecognized. And now we've pursued that. As I say, this thing I've just written, this other one about Beretashvili. And Beretashvili and Cincinnati were the first to really do the definition of the pathway for this interhemispheric action. That they showed in pigeons that if you destroyed the superior, the supraoptic decussation, that then one hemisphere couldn't talk with. So just this fiber bundle was the critical element in this interhemispheric interchange. And it's from that then that the split brain preparation was ultimately developed, and that's what our poster is in Chicago. So it's been fun doing this historical stuff. And,
yeah, that's very important.
Yeah.